Hey guys, this is Chapter 15, Section 2. And now, due to time constraint purposes, I'm going to be only doing Life at Versailles and onwards. So please bear with me there. You're going to have to read on until you get to Life at Versailles. Okay, here we go. Life at Versailles. Through most of the 17th century, the French court had no fixed home, following the monarch to his numerous palaces and country residences. In 1682, Louis moved his court and government to the newly renovated palace at Versailles, a former hunting lodge. The palace quickly became the center of a political, social, and cultural life. The king required all great nobles to spend at least part of the year in attendance on him there so he could keep an eye on their activities. Since he controlled the distribution of state power and wealth, nobles had no choice but to obey and compete with each other for his favor at Versailles. The glorious palace, with its sumptuous interiors and extensive formal gardens, was a mirror to the world of French glory, soon copied by would-be absolutist monarchs across Europe. See Living in the Past, Absolutist Palace, above. The reality of daily life in the palace was less glamorous. Versailles served as government offices for royal bureaucrats, as living quarters for the royal family and nobles, and as a place of work for hundreds of domestic servants. It was also open to the public at certain hours of each day. As a result, it was crowded with 3,000 to 10,000 people every single day. Even high nobles had to put up with the cramped living space, and many visitors complained of the noise, smell, and crowds. See primary source 15.2, Letter from Versailles, page 475. Now here I'm going to read the primary source, Living in the Past. Well, actually, this is not a primary source. My apologies. But this is on 472. By 1700, palace building had become a veritable obsession for European rulers. Their dramatic palaces symbolized for the age of absolutist power, just as soaring Gothic cathedrals had expressed the idealized spirit of high Middle Ages. With its classically harmonious, symmetrical, and geometric design, Versailles served as a model for the wave of palace building that began in the last decade of the 17th century. Royal palaces like Versailles were intended to overawe the people and proclaim their owners' authority and power. Located 10 miles southwest of Paris, Versailles began as a modest hunting lodge built by Louis XIII in 1623. His son, Louis XIV, spent decades enlarging and decorating the original structure. Between 1688 and 1670, architect Louis Lavaux enveloped the old building with a much larger one that still exists today. In 1682, the new palace became the official residence of the Sun King and his court, although construction continued until 1710, when the royal chapel was completed. At any one time, several thousand people occupied the bustling and crowded palace. The awesome splendor of the 80-yard hall of mirrors, replete with floor-to-ceiling mirrors and ceiling murals, illustrated the king's triumphs, contrasted with the strong odors from the courtiers who commonly relieved themselves in discreet corners. In 1693, Charles XI of Sweden, having reduced the power of the aristocracy, ordered the construction of his royal palace, which dominates the center of Stockholm to this day. Another such palace was Schönbrunn, an enormous Viennese Versailles built in 1695 by Emperor Leopold to celebrate Austrian military victories in Habsburg might. Shown at lower right is architect Joseph Bernard Fischer von Erlach's ambitious plan for Schönbrunn's palace. Fischer's plan emphasizes the palace's vast size and its role as a site for military demonstrations. Ultimately, financial constraints resulted in a more modest building. In Central and Eastern Europe, the favorite noble servants of royalty became extremely rich and powerful. They too built grandeur palaces in the capital cities. These palaces were in part an extension of the monarch, for they surpassed the buildings of less favored nobles and showed all the high road to fame and fortune. Take, for example, the palaces of Prince Eugene of Savoy, a French nobleman who became Austria's most famous military hero. It was Eugene who led the Austrian army, smashed the Turks, fought Louis XIV to a standstill, and generally guided the triumph of absolutism in Austria. Rewarded with great wealth by his grateful king, Eugene called on the leading architects of the day, Fischer von Erlach and Johann Lucas von Hildebrand, to consecrate his glory in stone and fresco. Fischer built Eugene's winter, or town, palace in Vienna, and he had Hildebrand collaborated on the prince's summer palace on the city's outskirts. The prince's summer residence featured two Baroque gems, the lower Belvedere and upper Belvedere, completed in 1722 and at left. The building's interior is equally stunning, with crouching giants serving as pillars and a magnificent great staircase. Now, this is continuing on with my previous assertions on life at Versailles, and this is going to be on page 474 if you're lost. Louis further revolutionized court life by establishing an elaborate set of etiquette rituals to mark every moment of his day, from waking up and dressing in the morning to removing his clothing and retiring at night. Courtiers vied for the honor of participating in these ceremonies, with the highest in rank claiming the privileges of handing the king his shirt. Endless squabbles broke out over what type of chair one could sit on at court, and the other in which great nobles entered and were seated in the chapel for mass. These rituals may seem absurd, but they were far from trivial. The king controlled immense resources and privileges. Access to him meant favored treatment from government offices, military and religious posts, state pensions, honorary titles, and a host of other benefits. The Duke of St. Simon wrote of the king's power at court in his memoirs. No one understood better than Louis XIV the art of enhancing the value of a favor by his manner of bestowing it. He knew how to make the most of a word, a smile, even a glance. If he addressed anyone, were it but to ask a trifling question or make some commonplace remark, all eyes were turned on the person so honored. It was a mark of favor, which always gave rise to comment. Courtiers sought these rewards for themselves and their family members and followers, a system of patronage in which a higher-ranked individual protected a lower-ranked one in return for loyalty and services flowed from the court to the provinces. Through this mechanism, Louis gained cooperation from powerful nobles. Although they could not hold public offices or posts, women played a central role in the patronage system. At court, the king's wife, mistresses, and other female relatives recommended individuals for honors, advocated policy decisions, and brokered alliances between factions. Noblewomen played a similar role, bringing their family connections to marriage to form powerful social networks. Onlookers sometimes resented the influence of powerful women at court. The Duke of St. Simon said of Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV's mistress and secret second wife, "Many people have been ruined by her, without having been able to discover the author of the ruin, search as they might." Louis XIV was also an enthusiastic patron of the arts, commissioning many sculptures and paintings for Versailles, as well as performances of dance and music. Scholars characterize the art and literature of the age of Louis XIV as French classicism. By this, they mean that the artists and the writers of the late 17th century imitated the subject matter and style of classical antiquity, that their work resembled that of Renaissance Italy, and that French art possessed the classical qualities of discipline, balance, and restraint. Louis XIV also loved the stage, and in the plays of Molière and Racine, his court witnessed the finest achievements in history of French theatre. In this period, aristocratic ladies wrote many genres of literature and held salons in their Parisian mansions where they engaged in witty and cultured discussions of poetry, art, theatre, and the latest worldly events. Their refined conversational style led Molière and other observers to mock them as précieuses, literally precious, or affected and pretentious. Despite this mockery, the précieuses represented an important cultural force ruled by a lead woman. With Versailles at the center of European politics, French culture grew in international prestige. French became the language of polite society and international diplomacy, gradually replacing the Latin as the language of scholarship and learning. Royal courts across Europe spoke French, and the great aristocrats of Russia, Sweden, Germany, and elsewhere were often more fluent in French than in the tongues of their homelands. France inspired a cosmopolitan European culture in the late 17th century that looked to Versailles at its center. Now we're going to look at primary source 15.2, a letter from Versailles. Born in 1652, the German princess Elizabeth Charlotte was the daughter of the Elector of the Palatinate, one of the many small states of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1671, she married the Duke of Orleans, brother of Louis XIV. When Louis's wife died in 1683, Elizabeth Charlotte became the highest-ranked woman at the French court. Despite the considerable pride she took in her position, her correspondence reveals her unhappiness and boredom with court life and her longing for home, as shown in the letter to her sister excerpted below. I have nothing to tell you. I walk and read and write. Sometimes the king drives me to hunt in his calèche. There are hunts every day. Sundays and Wednesdays are my son's days. The king's hunts Mondays and Thursdays. Wednesdays and Saturdays. Monseigneur, heir to the throne, hunts the wolf. M. le Comte de Toulouse, Mondays and Wednesdays. Duc de Man, Tuesdays, and M. de Luc, Fridays. They say if all the hunting kennels were united, there would come to be about 900 to 1,000 dogs. Twice a week there's a comedy, but you know, of course, that I go nowhere, due to the mourning for her recently deceased husband, which vexes me, for I must own that the theatre is the greatest amusement I have in the world, and the only pleasure that remains to me. If the court of France was what it used to be, one might learn here how to behave in society, but excepting the king and Monsieur, the king's brother, and her deceased husband, no one any longer knows what politeness is. The young men think only of horrible debauchery. I do not advise anyone to send their children here, for instead of learning good things, they will only take lessons in misconduct. You are right in blaming Germans who send their sons to France. How I wish that you and I were men and could go to the wars. But that's a completely useless wish to have. If I could go with propriety, return to Germany, you would see me there quickly. I love that country. I think it more agreeable than all others, because there is less luxury that I do not care for, and more of the frankness and integrity which I seek. But, be it said between ourselves, I was placed here against my will, and here I must stay till I die. There is no likelihood that we shall see each other again in this life, and what will become of us after that, God only knows. Next, we're going to speak about French financial management under Colbert. France's ability to build armies and fight wars depended on a strong economy. Fortunately for Louis, his controller general Jean-Baptiste Colbert in 1619 through 1683 proved to be a financial genius. Colbert's central principle was that wealth and the economy of France should serve the state. To this end, from 1665 to his death in 1683, Colbert rigorously applied mercantilist policies to France. Mercantilism is a collection of governmental policies for the regulation of economic activities by and for the state. It derives from the idea that a nation's international power is based on its wealth, specifically its supply of gold and silver. To accumulate wealth, a country always had to sell more goods abroad than it bought. To decrease the purchase of goods outside France, Colbert insisted that French industries should produce everything needed by the French people. To increase exports, Colbert supported the old industries and created new ones, focusing especially on textiles, which were the most important sector of the economy. Colbert enacted new production regulations, created guilds to boost quality standards, and encouraged foreign craftsmen to immigrate to France. To encourage the purchase of French goods, he abolished many domestic tariffs and raised tariffs on foreign products. In 1664, Colbert founded the Company of the East Indies, which with unfulfilled hopes of competing with the Dutch for Asian trade. Apologies for that blunder there. Colbert was also hoped to make Canada, rich in untapped minerals and some of the best agricultural land in the world, part of the vast French Empire. He sent 4,000 colonists to Quebec, whose capital had been founded in 1608 under Henry IV. Subsequently, the Jesuit Jacques Marquet and the merchant Louis Joliet sailed down the Mississippi River, which they named Colbert in honor of their sponsor. The name soon reverted to the original Native Americans one. Marquette and Joliet claimed possession of the land on both sides of the river as far south as the present day Arkansas. In 1684, French explorers continued down the Mississippi to its mouth and claimed vast territories for Louis XIV. The area was called naturally Louisiana. During Colbert's tenure as Controller General, Louis was able to pursue his goals without massive tax increases and without creating a stream of new offices. The constant pressure of warfare after Colbert's death, however, undid many of his economic achievements. Louis XIV's Wars. Louis XIV wrote that the character of a conqueror is regarded as the noblest and highest of titles. In pursuit of the title of conqueror, he kept France at war for 33 of the 54 years of his personal rule. François de Tellier, Marquis de Louvois, Louis' Secretary of State for War, equaled Colbert's achievements in the economic realm. Louvois created a professional army in which the French state, rather than private nobles, employed the soldiers. Uniforms and weapons were standardized, and a rational system of training and promotion was devised. Many historians believe that the new loyalty, professionalism, and growth of the French army represented the peak of Louis's success in reforming government, as in so many other matters. His model was followed across Europe. Louis's goal was to expand France to what he considered its natural borders. His armies managed to extend French borders to include important commercial centers in the Spanish Netherlands and Flanders, as well as the entire province of French Comté between 1667 and 1678. In 1681, Louis seized the city of Strasbourg, and 3 years later he sent his armies into the province of Lorraine. At the moment, the king seemed invincible. In fact, Louis had reached the limit of his expansion. The wars of 1680s and 1690s brought no additional territories, but placed unbearable constraints on French resources. Colbert's successors resorted to desperate measures to finance these wars, including devaluation of the currency and new taxes. Louis's last war was endured by a French people suffering high taxes, crop failure, and widespread malnutrition and death. In 1700, the childless Spanish king, Charles II, reigning from 1665 to 1700, died, opening a struggle for the control of Spain and its colonies. His will bequeathed the Spanish crown and its emperor to Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson. Louis's wife, Maria Theresa, had been Charles's sister. The will violated a prior treaty by which the European powers had agreed to divide the Spanish possessions between the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, both brothers-in-law of Charles II. Claiming that he was following both Spanish and French interests, Louis broke with the treaty and accepted the will, thereby triggering the War of the Spanish Succession, lasting from 1701 to 1713. In 1701, the English, Dutch, Austrians, and Prussians formed the Grand Alliance against Louis XIV. War dragged on until 1713. The Peace of Utrecht, which ended the war, allowed Louis's grandson, Philip, to remain King of Spain on the understanding that the French and Spanish crowns would never be united. France surrendered to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay Territory to England, which also acquired Gibraltar, Minorca, and control of the African slave trade from Spain. And you can see map 15.2 for information on the African slave trade. Now the Peace of Utrecht represented the balance of power principle in operation, setting limits on the extent to which any one power, in this case France, could expand. It also marked the end of French expansion. 35 years of war had given France the rights to all of the Alsace and some commercial centers in the north, but at what price? In 1714, an exhausted France hovered on the brinks of bankruptcy. It is no wonder that when Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, many subjects felt as much relief as they did sorrow. The decline of absolutist Spain in 17th century. At the beginning of the 17th century, France's position appeared extremely weak, struggling to recover from decades of religious civil war that had destroyed its infrastructure and economy. France could not dare to compete with Spain's European and overseas empire or its mighty military. Yet, by the end of the century, their positions were reversed, and France had surpassed all expectations to attain European dominance. By the early 17th century, the seeds of Spanish disaster were sprouting. Between 1610 and 1650, Spanish trade with the colonies in the New World fell 60% due to the competition from local industries in the colonies and from Dutch and English traders. At the same time, the native Indian and African slaves who toiled in the South American silver mines suffered frightful epidemics of disease. Ultimately, the mines that filled the empire's treasury started to run dry, and the quantity of metal produced steadily declined after 1620. In Madrid, however, royal expenditures constantly exceeded income. To meet mountainous state debt, the crown repeatedly devalued the coinage and declared bankruptcy, which resulted in the collapse of national credit. Meanwhile, the manufacturing and commerce shrank. In contrast to the other countries of Western Europe, Spain had a tiny middle class. The elite condemned money-making as vulgar and undignified. Thousands entered economically unproductive professions. There were said to be 9,000 monasteries in the province of Castile alone. To make matters worse, the crown expelled some 300,000 Moriscos, or former Muslims, in 1609, significantly reducing the pool of skilled workers and merchants. Those working in the textile industry were forced out of business by steep inflation that pushed their production costs to the point to where they could not compete in colonial and international markets. Spanish aristocrats, attempting to maintain an extravagant lifestyle they could no longer afford, increased the rents on their estates. High rents and heavy taxes in turn drove the peasants from the land, leading to a decline in agricultural productivity. In city wages and production stagnated. Spain also ignored new scientific methods that might have improved agricultural or manufacturing techniques because they came from the heretical nations of Holland and England. The Spanish crown had no solutions to these dire problems. Philip III, reigning from 1598 to 1621, a melancholy and deeply pious man, handed the running of the government over to the Duke of Lerma, who used it to advance his personal and familial wealth. Philip IV, reigning from 1621 to 1665, left the management of his several kingdoms to Gaspar de Guzman, Count Duke of Olivares. Olivares was an able administrator who has often been compared to Richelieu. He did not lack energy and ideas, and he succeeded in devising new sources of revenue, but he clung to the grandeur belief that the solution to Spain's difficulties rested in a return to the imperial tradition of the 16th century. Unfortunately, the imperial tradition demanded the revival of war with the Dutch at the expiration of a 12-year truce in 1622 and a long war with France over Mantua from 1628 to 1659. Spain thus became embroiled in the 30 Years' War. These conflicts, on top of an empty treasury, brought disaster. Spain's situation worsened with internal conflicts and fresh military defeats through the remainder of the 17th century. In 1640, Spain faced serious revolts in Catalonia and Portugal. In 1643, the French inflicted a crushing defeat on a Spanish army at Rocroi, in which is now Belgium. By the Treaty of Pyrenees of 1659, which ended the French-Spanish conflict, Spain was compelled to surrender extensive territories to France. In 1688, the Spanish crown reluctantly recognized the independence of Portugal, almost a century after the two crowns were joined. The era of Spanish dominance in Europe had ended. Now we're going to go back to page 477. Just take a look at this map right here. This is map 15.2, Europe after the Peace of Utrecht in 1715. The series of treaties, commonly called the Peace of Utrecht, ended the War of Spanish Succession and redrew the map of Europe. A French Bourbon king succeeded to the Spanish throne. France surrendered the Spanish Netherlands, later Belgium, then in French hands to Austria, and recognized the Hohenzollern rulers of Prussia. Spain ceded Gibraltar to Great Britain, for which it has been a strategic naval station ever since. Spain also granted Britain the Asiento, the contract for supplying African slaves to the Americas. And now, if you do not have the book on you right now, I'm just simply going to show what this map looks like. So here's your map key. If it will focus. You have your kind of lime green as the British, your kind of pinkish color as the French, and your blue color as the Spanish. Here's a little bit more information. This will show you the rest of the empires, as well as the HRE boundary. Now I'm going to go and read the final source right here. This is just above near the end of the chapter on page 478. Now this is talking about Spanish troops. The long wars that Spain fought over Dutch independence in support of the Habsburg interests in Germany and against France left the country militarily exhausted and financially drained by the mid-17th century. In this detail from a painting by Peter Snayers, Spanish troops, thin, emaciated, and probably unpaid, straggle away from the battle. Alright guys, thank you very much for listening. I do apologize for not being able to read the other part, but I do have plans for today. I also do apologize for my atrocious spelling of some of these words. I'm sure some of you guys can pronounce these way better than I can. Anyways, I hope you guys have an awesome rest of the weekend, or Monday, depending on when you're listening to this. Alright, stay classy. Yeah, I took that from Ron Burgundy. Alright, bye.